Good evening and welcome to Broadview's National Online Reading Club. My name is Emma Prestwich and I'm Broadview's digital editor. Working behind the scenes to help me out tonight is Sharon Doran, Broadview's promotions manager. We're so glad you've taken an hour out of your evening to be here with us. We'd love to know who you are and where you're all from. So please say hello from your hometown in the chat space. This evening, we're going to hear from writer and photographer Vivian Ketchum, illustrator Webb, and Pastor Victoria Loorz. In a few moments, I'll introduce you to our great guests, but just a few more notes before we start. After our speakers have told us a bit about themselves, please be brave and ask some questions. I do have some prepared, but this event is a chance for all of you to connect with our speakers. So you can ask questions in a couple of different ways. You can type, "I have a question" into the chat, and I'll call on you as time allows, and then switch on your audio and ask your question. You can also type your question into the chat and I'll ask it for you. So that's about it. Let's get started. Our first guest is Vivian Ketchum. Vivian is a writer, photographer, and social activist. She's also a residential school survivor who wrote and photographed Survivor's Journey in our October-November issue about her road trip with 2 other survivors and many others, as they brought gifts and prayers to First Nations communities mourning the children whose remains were found at former school sites. Please join me in welcoming Vivian. Vivian, feel free.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, my name is Vivian. I usually, when I'm talking about the subject, I usually use my first name only, because as I said, what was mentioned was that I'm a residential school survivor. My dad attended the same residential school, Cecil Jeffrey, as me in Kenora, Ontario. And somehow they took his last name away from him, so I don't know what my real last name is, and they gave him the last name Ketchum. So anytime I do presentations like this, I only use my first name, and because that's the name my mom and dad gave me. And how this article came about was I was at home, like sitting in front of my computer as I am now, and on Facebook, and then I got a message from Grandma Shingoose, or Geraldine Shingoose, as she's formerly called, and she said news of the 215 were happening in Kamloops, BC, and Grandma Shingoose was kind of upset, and she wanted to do more than just hit like on Facebook. So we're talking about exchanging ideas, and I said, how about we go and put ribbons on the Catholic church down there, down St. Mary's downtown on St. Mary's Avenue. So we agreed to meet later up on that day, and we put 215 orange ribbons along the fence. Other residential school survivors came and joined us, and Grandma Shingoose sang a song. But we felt that wasn't enough. We were being told that we were being driven to do more than that. And another survivor, a youth activist, decided to do the 4-day sacred fire at the legislative building in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And when we did that, and there were so many people joining up to leave shoes at the legislative steps, and there was 2 teepees set up there, and there was a lot of people joining in, and we even had a little birthday cake for those children that never had a birthday. And there was so many events that happened during this 4 days, and at the end of the 4 days, there was ideas of heading to BC. And Grandma Shingoose told me, she suggested we should go to BC, and I thought that was a lot of BC. For one thing, I had no money, and I don't know if I could take 2 weeks off to go to BC. But somehow things happened, and I felt I was driven to go, and so I took time off from work to go down there, and we made all the arrangements. We're doing fundraising before we left, and we finally got all the money together. We got all the gifts and that Grandma Shingoose had arranged to take down there. And something weird happened just before we left. There was one fundraising that happened online before we left, and it was about $800. Okay, so we that happened, and then when we got to Brandon, we had car troubles. We had to, and our grandma had couldn't get her vehicle going. And I thought, is it, like we were sitting at the gas station, our caravan, we're just deciding what to do. And finally, we decided to rent a vehicle. And when we rented the vehicle, the amount came up to exactly $800. So this trip was meant to happen. So we were going along, and we finally got on our way again. And I'm posting on Facebook what was happening, and Amy McLaughlin and Andrew Fayaz were like on my Facebook page, and they're following around my posts on Facebook, and I didn't realize I was getting a lot of people. A lot of my posts are being shared and everything else, and there was we were pretty open. Our vehicles were covered in orange messages and the 215 and everything else, and we're wearing our orange T-shirts. We were doing a lot of teaching moments along the way, but we also had some very racist moments. In Golden, when we were going to the mountains, a white guy, I hate to say that, but a white guy in a car tried to run us off the mountain. We had to, because our vehicle was pretty known that we're indigenous and we're doing residential school survivors, and that we're pretty open. And this guy tried to run us off the road. We had to pull over. We were totally, totally frightened, and we could not believe that happened. Another incident didn't happen at the restaurant where we finally decided to go have a meal with Grandma Shingu's, Billy, and her granddaughter, and I got up to leave because the meal was already paid for. I get up, and then that woman, that lady, accused me of trying to walk out, dine and dash. I said, no, it's being paid for. And again, she kept insisting that I was trying to walk out without paying. We had a big issue there. And it's the benefits of traveling with strong Indigenous women. They all backed me up. They all supported me. I was in tears. I could not believe this was happening. And the issue was resolved and kept going. So this is some of the things that weren't mentioned in the magazine. It was difficult. We did run into some issues, but there was a lot of good teaching moments. I'm taking most of the good out of that trip. And when we were at the hotels, we all were pretty close to each other in the hotel rooms, and we left our hotel rooms unlocked, and we're all zipping along, and we're all supporting each other. Somebody needed toothpaste. Well, here, we're going to this door, and there's toothpaste there. And every time we had a breakdown or a difficult time, we knew we could knock on a door and go get that support. I was traveling with a lot of strong Indigenous women who were community leaders in their area. So that was one of the benefits, that we're supporting each other. If I felt weak in one moment, there'd be 5 or 7 of them others willing to help me out. And it was really difficult. We pulled up, the scenery was beautiful, beautiful hills and everything else. So beautiful. Then we go around the corner, and we saw all those little flags, all those, so many. And the first word that came up to my mind was, this is what genocide looks like. That's why you see a picture of Grandma Shingu's crying. I was crying. And some of our caravan, we had our time getting out of our vehicles. We were so overcome with the emotion. And we had to kind of take a moment and to gather ourselves. And then we went and asked permission from the community leaders if we could walk. And we dropped off stuff, little gifts on every one of those graves. Every one of those unmarked graves got a gift from us that we had to go gather across the field, and we had to sit there and sing songs to these little ones, and to gather our strength and to give what we had to these little ones in unmarked graves. And then we had good welcome, and the community was so welcoming, so warm, despite what they were going through, and they were welcoming us with open arms. And we stayed there longer than till evening, and we went on our way. And we were so overcome what happened in that community. We had to, when we got to BC, we had to stay, have some time off for a couple of days to collect ourselves. Then Grandma Shingoose, on the morning, she went and prepared all the gifts and everything. Then we went down and dropped off the gifts. And again, that Kamloops community was so warm and welcoming. It was extremely hot, and it was there was ashes falling in the air, and the heat was really bad. But they stood there, and the chief was dealing with the fire issues, the BC Graves, but they took time, a couple of hours to spend time with us, and that was beautiful. It was so welcoming to us. And then when we had to start our way back, and Grandma Shingu said, we've come back with a lot of stories. We felt we were given a message by the little ones to let them know what we saw, what the little ones were telling us, to go and tell them what we saw. We felt we were driven now to carry that message to the public. Yes, we were hurt. We were hurt only by our own residential school experiences, but what we saw. And even Grandma Shingoose was we had to stop at another residential school to look around, and then Grandma Shingoose got physically sick. She was overwhelmed. We saw things. We visited other residential school sites, and we saw stuff that angered us, that got to us with our 4 circles. What I mean by the 4 parts of the circle is physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. It affected the 4, and so that's why we had to smudge and look after ourselves. But we felt empowered when we come back here. When we got to Winnipeg, my Facebook page was blowing up, and that's when Amy told me that she would like to do the magazine spread. I said, okay, so the pictures and everything else. I guess a lot of people were getting were touched by what I was posting. I didn't really realize how many people I was reaching out or that were affected by what I was posting on Facebook. So this Facebook post became a story. This does not end with just a story on Broadview magazine. We were working, me and Grandma Shingoose and other survivors, we were working hard to get the message about September 30th, to let them know about the unmarked graves, and other stuff about residential school survivors and that. So that is basically how it came about, and I much appreciation to Amy and Andrew for allowing me to get this story out on Broadview magazine. So that is much appreciated. And I am doing, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Vivian. It sounds like a very difficult and a very emotional trip for you and for the other grandmas who were with you. You express yourself in many different ways. The beautiful poetry, the heartbreaking poetry from your photo essay. You also express yourself in photos and in prose as well. Is there one of those that you find the most useful for processing your feelings around your feelings, your grief, around these discoveries, around your experiences at residential school?
Probably that poem more likely did it. That poem at the end, it kind of when I wrote that, it just came pouring out like so that I think that got to me. That's put a lot of emotions in that poem.
Rob Metcalf has a question. Do you want to ask your question, Rob? Rob, do you want to unmute yourself? There you are.
I got it. Yes, I noticed in the Observer article there was a picture of a list of children uncovered. And there are a number of these that I had not heard about. And I guess the media is just sort of given up on recording that. But I wondered if there were a lot more happening since the article.
Definitely a lot more here in Manitoba. I haven't gotten the numbers. The numbers just keep going up. And I think there are people keeping track. This is just Manitoba that the numbers, they haven't yet started in Northern Ontario, but I know that, I'm not sure if the numbers have been up, but there is a lot more numbers now. I think there's about possibly 5,000, possibly more, 6,000, I think it is, yeah. Around 6,000 that they found. I haven't really looked at the numbers.
Okay.
Vivian, Victoria is wondering if you could read your poem. Do you have it with you?
Yeah, just a minute, I'll get it in the back here.
Okay, sounds good.
When the whispers began, skipping rope, double dutch, dandelions, into a chain, yellow buttercup flower under the chin. Do you like butter? The smell of grass mixed with the smell of sewer nearby. The shiny swing with its long chains. The chains of the swing that pinch the palm of your hands. Beehive monkey bars, always too scared to go up to the top. My hands and feet were too small. The group of trees with its sticky sap, the green hedge with its thorny bushes. It went around the building, that basement window with that odd mirror. It twisted your image if you danced in front of it. That gray stairwell that kids knew to avoid. Strange things happened up those stairs in that office. Sounds picturesque, ideal, but it was my prison as a child, where I learned where the whisperings began.
Thank you. Thank you for being willing to do that. You and Geraldine and Chickadee all embrace the identity of grandma. Besides being grandmothers yourselves, what else does that word mean to you?
Reclaiming probably the word grandma, because so many of our kids, grandchildren are taken away, are lost, and we're just trying to reclaim that title. So many, like even now, I'm a grandma without a grandchild. I've lost my grandchild to the system. So grandma is a community, it's like one who looks after the community. There's a lot of respect for what Grandma Shingus does in the community. So right now she's carrying a heavy load. And she's also becoming, her granddaughter is having a baby. So that was a lot of good news that happened on September. She got the news on September 30th that her granddaughter was expecting, and that was such great news. So
that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you, you were connected to and involved with the Presbyterian Church. How can you reconcile its involvement in, how do you feel about its involvement in the residential school system as someone who is part of that church?
Well, I sit on a lot of committees. I've been working with them on healing and reconciliation events. So I see that as trying to create change within. They get a lot of reports, but I'm sitting there at their table, and they don't get the watered down version of what's happening in the community. They get it right right there from what I'm telling them. And some of how I teach them is not nice, but that happens behind closed doors. We have disagreements and that, but that happens as I'm teaching my brother or sister. I do gentle teachings with them, and they've done a lot. They did their apology, their confession. They're right now. They're willing to put up money to look for the little ones in Cecil Jeffrey and other. They ran about 11 residential schools, and they're willing to put money up front to start the search for unmarked graves. So they're they're doing a lot of proactive work. So I'm making sure that that they're on the right path. So either that, they'll get a gentle scolding from me.
Very important. Thank you so much, Vivian.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Our next guest, we're so pleased to have him join us. He's joining us from another continent where it's past midnight. So incredibly special to have him with us. This is illustrator Neil Webb. Neil's an award-winning illustrator who's brought many Broadview stories to life in image form. His work has also appeared in the BBC, Nature, The Economist, and The Washington Post. His artwork is usually conceptual, and he says some of his inspiration comes from early 20th century design. His most recent published piece for us illustrated Safe Harbor, our UCC and Focus feature about United Church support for supervised consumption sites. Please join me in welcoming Neil.
Hi everyone, hello. Thanks for inviting me to be here. It's a real privilege. I've been working with you for a while now. I just wanted to say at the top of it as well that just hearing what Vivian was saying was incredibly powerful. It's not something I know about. I'm living in the UK, but it was very affecting. And now I'm going to talk about making pictures, which seems maybe not quite the same register, but yeah, I'll talk a little bit about what I do for the magazine. I think I've actually been working for the magazine since 2016 when I started doing a small column for the conundrum section, and then in 2019 was asked to work on the covers for In Focus. And that's been great. I'm working with Carol Muscott, the art director, and she's a really great art director. She gives me really concise brief about lots of different subjects, a range of subject matter, but mainly to do with faith and spirituality. And that's kind of a new area for me as an illustrator to tackle some of those themes, but a really fascinating and interesting one. Yeah, the main thing I get from a lot of those articles is just the sort of inclusivity and the warmth, and that's what I draw on for inspiration for a lot of those stories. So maybe I should say something about how I got into being an illustrator. I think really from childhood as a kid, I just drew all the time.
Neil, do you mind speaking up just the tiniest bit, or maybe moving a little bit closer to your computer?
Of
A few
course,
folks, I think, are having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Let me see if I can. Is that any better?
That is better.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
No problem. Yeah, as a kid, I drew constantly, and something about escaping into a sort of imaginary world. I drew a lot of dinosaurs and knights, sometimes in the same picture. So that was my sort of go-to place as a kid. Was just to keep drawing, and that's what carried on into school. And I wasn't great at any other subject, so I ended up going to university and studying under a really great tutor called Jeff Granfield, who really taught us about using ideas in illustration, really kind of focusing on the conceptual element of bringing elements from a text together and then making something interesting out of them. And then what I've tried to do in my work is that really. So it adds a kind of visual twist or a kind of a bit of magic to a picture that complements the text and kind of makes the hopefully the viewer do a kind of second take on something, and it just adds another element. So yeah, I've got some work I could show if that would be appropriate. I could share the screen and talk about some of the covers that I've done. If that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah, we can.
Yeah. Okay.
We can give you screen sharing access.
I've made that available.
Perfect. So you should be able to share your screen now, Neil.
Okay, I'll go for that. Okay, is that working? Are you seeing?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is just a few of the covers, and I suppose I'll go through some of the process that I use when I get the brief. This one was about how the church needed to react to COVID and sort of reconstruct itself. So the usual process for me is to draw a few ideas, a few concepts, and these are the sketches on the left here, which try to sum that up in some way, in an interesting way. And there's various ideas here, but just to go through, the one that was chosen with this kind of Rubik's Cube of the church that's eventually going to get resolved into the full cube. So with the in focus format, I do the cover, and then usually it's a bit like a narrative inside. The picture kind of resolves in some way. There's an end to the story. So on the cover we have the kind of Rubik's Cube church being all out of sync, and then it's kind of resolved in the inside image. So that was one that I did that I was kind of pleased with. And moving on to another, this is another set of ideas for a spiritual story about a spiritual retreat out in the countryside, out in the woods. And I again came up with lots of different ideas about growth and renewal, and the ideas that we ended up with were this idea of an acorn that kind of then goes in the narrative to an oak leaf. So here it is. It was as I understood it, quite a run-down building, and a community wasn't thriving there, but that got fixed up, and then it became a place for people to go to. So that was the kind of the idea there. This one was around addiction to opiates, and how hard it is for people to escape that. But this story was about a treatment centre that's doing exactly that and helping people get off of that problem.
Or bacon and tomato sandwiches.
And there's various concepts that I've come up with again here on the left. This is the one that we chose for. It became the idea of a kind of merry-go-round that people can't escape from, and it's in the form of a large drug or pill, and then gets resolved with everybody being brought off of that cycle at the bottom there. Okay, moving on. I think this was the one that you referred to, the sort of latest cover about the treatment centre. And again, the idea was to use this kind of life ring as a symbol for safety and rescue, and that's what we went with. So it's a kind of catch-all symbol for that idea. And then inside, people are getting treatment. And I think that's it for the covers. I've got more other work that's not for In Focus I could show if there's time.
These are amazing, Neil. Thank you. I'm looking at the sketches and thinking maybe that's something I could do. the sketch itself, a very janky version, but the translation to the eventual end product is so striking. I really loved the one you did for the retreat centers piece. That turned out beautifully.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, the sketching part really is just the sort of the idea stage and the concept stage, and then everything else, you know, it's produced digitally in Photoshop, and yeah, it's moved on from the sketches. Yeah.
Thank you. Wanted to allow folks a chance to ask Neil some questions if they would like to. Feel free to put your question into the chat box, and then I will call on you. While we wait for that, I have a question first. I'm wondering, people have probably noticed that the 2 full-page illustrations for the United Church in Focus section are slightly different from one another. Is there a reason that those 2 pieces are separate? Or are you telling the story through those 2 different images?
Yeah, the idea is a kind of narrative, I suppose. So you have the cover that presents the story, and then in the second image it's changed slightly as a kind of resolution to whatever's happened. So, you know, for instance, on that last image, everyone had been on the sort of the inside image, everybody had been welcomed in and they were getting treatment, and so there's always a kind of you know, hopefully a positive solution in the second image is the idea.
Michael has a question for you. Go ahead, Mike.
Great. Hi, Neil. I don't really know the process in terms of how much back and forth you usually get with the people who've worked on the story, so either the people writing it or editing it or handling it. So I'm not sure, you know, how much opportunity for communication there is there. But I'm kind of curious about, if there is some, how often do you find yourselves landing on the same page really quickly in terms of you really understanding, you feeling like you're getting what they're putting in the story, and them interpreting the image in the same way? And for the situations where maybe that doesn't happen immediately, do you have a process that you usually use to try and resolve that?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, actually, it all comes through the art director, Carol. So she writes a very sort of concise brief. She also sends me the article, you know, but she writes a very sort of salient points. So in all honesty, I don't have any contact with the writers directly. It's a case of sending my sketches off to Carol and then getting approval on one of them. So it's, you know, that's partly why I send quite a few different options, because it's quite hard to hit the mark first time, and you know, you want to make sure that you're representing things properly. So yeah, it's all through the art director, Carol, who does this incredible job of making it easy for me to understand what the story's about, I think. Yeah.
Our art director, Carol, is actually here tonight. So I know you folks probably haven't had a chance to meet in person, but exchanged many emails. Carol, I wondered if you wanted to share part of the process of working with Neil.
Hi, I'm Carol Moscott. I'm the art director of Broadview magazine, and it would be a pleasure to talk about my process with Neil. Neil and I have never seen one another. This is our first live meeting. I've been working as an art director in magazines in Canada for over 30 years, and for most of that time, I would pick up a phone and I would call an illustrator and ask if they would like to work with me on a story. However, nowadays, it seems that email has replaced most communication. And Neil, being ahead in the UK, and I communicate entirely by email. First of all, Neil is a brilliant illustrator and an excellent communicator in general. I started working for the magazine when I came to design it in 2019. And Neil had already been doing some work for the magazine. And I wanted to give Neil a larger role in the illustration work that we had in the magazine. He has such an intuitive, conceptual approach to illustration. His illustrations, Neil, your illustrations are very smart and concise and conceptual, and are able to get to the core of an issue very quickly. The way that Neil and I work is that I get an article from the editor and I read it top to bottom, and my job is to find a way to tell the story with illustration. Why illustration versus photography? They're such very different approaches to telling a story. It's what I do and what Neil do, we tell stories. And with a photograph, you can take a portrait of someone, you can take a beautiful landscape photo, and it tells a story very directly. With illustration, what Neil does is he is able to interpret and give a unique spin on a concept and take people deeper into an idea. So when we started working together, I said to Neil, what I'd like to do with the United Church in Focus feature is that we are shown a problem, a challenge that we face in the United Church. And we're also within this article shown a way that the church is working very hard to resolve those challenges. And on the cover, we show that challenge. And on the interior, as Neil has explained, we show the solution, or the approach to the solution, or how we're heading towards the solution. Neil sends me very, very precise and detailed sketches that explain exactly what his proposed solutions are. And he often sends me many more sketches than I could ever have hoped for. And they're all wonderful, but there is always one that solves the problem beautifully. And the color palette, we speak about it, is seasonal because we put many issues out over the course of the year. And we go back and forth for a couple, where Neil takes the chosen sketch, he executes a more finished version of that sketch, shows it to me. It looks less like a sketch and more like what you would think is see as a highly polished illustration. We do some small visual tweaks, then I get a final image and I use it in the magazine. As Neil explained, my briefs, which are essentially a long explanation of what the idea for the article is, what I'm looking for in terms of a concept, are my interpretation of how I see the problem and the solution coming together. And Neil brings this all together visually in a very concise visual summation. So in a nutshell, and I'm sorry if I spoke very long, that is how we work together.
Thank you so much, Carol.
Yeah,
To get some of the behind the scenes. Absolutely. And thank you so much, Neil. One final question. Do you have a favorite illustration that you've created for Broadview? I know there have been so many.
I think probably the retreat, the one that you mentioned earlier with the acorn and the oak leaf. Yeah, it's just nice way to kind of frame it in that way. Yeah, that's a favorite, I think.
It is hard to pick. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Our final guest will take us away from our screens and into the woods. Please welcome Victoria Loorz. Victoria is a pastor who created the Church of the Wild and co-founded the Wild Church Network, an affiliation of congregations across North America that help people find the divine in nature. She has been engaged with the integration of spirit and earth for over 30 years as a writer, a pastor of indoor and wild churches, a climate activist, and an eco-spiritual director. Josiah Neufeld interviewed her for our cover story, Worship in the Wild. Victoria, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much. What a privilege to be here. Vivian, your images and your story is heartbreaking and brings us to our knees, really. And at the core of Church of the Wild and the Wild Church movement is a journey to return to what I think Indigenous peoples never left, is a deep kindred connection with the natural world. And there's so much damage that has been done, not only to our earth, but to people because of this deep disconnection and a system of domination that is sort of the foundation of empire building and colonization and religious traditions, particularly the Christian tradition. And so for me, I've been seeking to restore spirituality and the natural world for pretty much all of my career, the last 30 years, both as a pastor and then as a climate activist. And I found that in both my work as a pastor in an indoor church and as a leader of a youth climate organization, in both of those situations, I hit a place of deep, actually despair, but we might call it burnout. And there's something intrinsically wrong with both of those systems. And I, in my search for what it is that is what was causing me burnout, I hit this place of emptiness. And there was about a 7-year time where I left working in a church. I was working in left working the climate movement and trying to understand and deepen into what is going on here. And it was actually learning to and experiencing that we are not, that our spirituality and the natural world are not disconnected. We perceive them as disconnected. And so I began to explore practices and also the theology within my own tradition. Like, is this disconnection something that's deeply embedded in the core of the Christian tradition? Because if it is, I don't know if I can stay. And a lot of people feel that it's an either or kind of thing. I love the world, I love nature, I love trees, and I love the church, but I can't hold them both together. And that was my experience for many years. And so in 2015, I finally decided I'm going to leave the indoor church. I was a pastor then. And I realized that just meeting inside of a church building, and most churches are built in the old Roman architectural way, where if there are any windows at all, they're covered with stained glass or something like that. And what it does is it has this implicit message that what's holy is inside, and therefore what's not holy is outside. And there's all kinds of words that are used within the church that keeps us separate from the natural world. Like God is not a tree. God is that's pantheism or animism or something like that. And then I started seeking more deeply into these stories, even within my own tradition. And I found that every single leader in both of the testaments of the Christian scriptures, every leader was led into the wilderness at a pivotal time in their history, as well as a pivotal time of their own leadership. And so I started to wonder about that, because as a preacher before that, I used to sort of spiritualize that wilderness, that was just a wilderness time, a difficult time, something like that. But I started to realize, no, there's something else here. There's some reason why these people are drawn into the wilderness. And what is that? What role does the waters and the soil and the animals and the places and the wind play in this call into the wilderness? And it wasn't until I actually began to experience that kindred connection with trees, and it was a particular moment where I was in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, And 3 days in a row, a female mule deer laid down before me. 3 different deer, 3 days in a row. And it was I was astonished every day when it happened. She was 15 feet in front of me or so, and I was just invited to sit in the meadow with her for a while, for a time, just to be there. And that shifted me. There was something in that that made me know that this connection was more than just a really cool experience, but that I was being invited into a relationship. And that relationship is actually at the core of what was causing, the lack of that relationship was at the core of what was causing me burnout, both in the church as well as in the climate work. That we were so just being disconnected from these others that we are connected to, not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And that disconnection led to not only leads to a desecration of the land that we see now, but also a desecration of our own spirituality, our own souls, as well as a desecration of our connection with other humans at the core of that. So so I started a church. I decided to leave buildings altogether and start meeting at the edges of our town, and develop spiritual practices that reconnect us with the natural world as sacred. And so the core of that is basically a time of wandering out in nature individually and coming back together and sharing that. We also consider and make sure that we acknowledge the land, and not just acknowledge the indigenous peoples that had lived on this land, but really seek to befriend people and to hear the stories. When I started the church in Southern California, I invited Julie Tumamai Stensley, who was an elder in the Chumash Nation there, and I asked her to come to do an Ash Wednesday service after our land had been completely burnt. So our whole land was in ashes, and she came with a Shinto priest also, and we held an Ash Wednesday service honoring all of the animals that died in terror, all of the trees and the forests that were gone as a result of this fire. And in that, Julie started telling us stories about this land that her grandfather and her great-grandfather grew up in. And when I moved away from California to come to upstate Washington, Julie took over the Wild Church and took over that church and still leads it in Southern California. So, gosh, there's so many millions of things I can say, but I
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, what has the pandemic done for, as you described it, our ability to behold one another as inherently sacred?
Yes. Well, I think on one level, the pandemic has, the virus herself has reminded us how interconnected we are. Earth reaches out, and even this little tiny organism has helped us to see how we are deeply interconnected. It's also by being on lockdown, especially in the beginning, a lot of people had no choice but to go out to the land. And even that was cut off for some people, and you could feel that disconnection. So it sort of invited a reconnection in a way that we would have never anticipated. And it's also just interesting how there's always a shadow and a sun and a sunny side of everything. That technology has given us things like this. Like, I never would have been able to connect with you if I had to fly to Ontario. That we have this Zoom. So I lead a organization called Seminary of the Wild, and it's people all over North America. About a third of the people are from Canada, and there's some people from the UK and from the United States. And we meet weekly and to learn the practices of deepening our sacred relationship with the land and learn from people who have been doing this for generations. So I think the pandemic has also drawn us to alternative ways of connecting, ironically.
It certainly has, and we're so glad that we can hold events like this and connect with folks across the country and the continent and other continents as well. Rob has a question. Rob, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, my experience of outdoor church was at camp in the summer when I was a youth. But when I started thinking about outdoor services, my mind went right away to practicalities because I was thinking in terms of what we normally do in the building. So sing hymns and be protected from the weather and stuff like that. And I get the feeling that your worship is quite different. Could you tell us more about it?
Sure, sure. And there are quite a few wild churches in Canada who meet all winter. and and some churches, actually very much the minority, some churches do kind of try to do what they do in an indoor, only meet outdoor. And what they'll do sort of minimally is include the more than human others as part of the beloved community. And they'll change their liturgy, change their maybe their communion and things like that. But the majority of churches, which is really interesting, do something a little more radically different. I thought I was making it up when I first started the first Church of the Wild, and then as I started meeting others who thought that they were making it up, we all kind of thought we were a little crazy and what are we doing here? But we found out that what we were doing was very similar. And so here's a typical, if you get my book, which comes out tomorrow, by the way, Church of the Wild, at the back there's a resource, and I kind of walk you through step by step of what I normally do in a wild church. But basically there's a beginning part where we sort of gather and listen in silence and welcome all of the others, and the trees and the wind and the grasshoppers. And we always sit in a circle. And there's usually an invitation that I do in the beginning, some kind of invitation to pay attention and to bring your curiosity to the land. And that's sort of, then at that point, people leave the circle and they wander on their own for about 45 minutes to an hour. And they'll allow themselves, there's just really simple practices that we've learned from people who have not disconnected. And so one of those practices is wander until, cross a threshold of the circle. Wander until you feel drawn to some other. Maybe it's the river, maybe it's the clouds, maybe it's a particular color or an insect. and then settle down before them and ask permission. If you can have a conversation. And that conversation may happen silently. It may happen in a poem that you write. It may happen with movement. It may happen with maybe you speak out loud. But you're allowing yourself to open up to the reality of this other who is an other and is connected with us and is connected with the sacred. So the first time when I had this conversation with these deer, I heard in my heart what I would have normally called the voice of God say to me, "I am with you always." And as I deepened into this, I realized that sacred was also connected with this deer. It wasn't just that she happened to be this metaphor of something, but that she was a part of that relationship. And so then we come back together and share our experiences. So there's something in that witnessing that's really important. Of listening to one another, restoring as restoration, restoring with poetry and with encounters and with stories about these others that we're in deep community with.
One more question from Valerie. Valerie's wondering whether or not you noticed, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, that the natural environment became more healthy. We in the North experienced cleaner smelling air, more animals appearing naturally, and many other aspects. Is that part of your church in the wild?
Wasn't that such a gift? Oh my gosh. I don't, we in the beginning of the pandemic would meet on Zoom. It never really quite felt right to me, but it's the best that we could do. So it wasn't part of my church, but I love that. I love that that is telling us a story, even just reading about, like the dolphins in Italy and you'd see the pictures of deer walking down the street in Japan. And I really do think that as we back off, that the animals feel more welcome, and there's a way to approach them with that reverence, with that sense of reverence that also pulls them out. Like there's deer that come and sleep and lay right outside my window every day now, that they know, what you pay attention to pays attention to you is really true. And as we honor them as beings that have a right to be in this place where we have taken over, I think just even that prayer makes a difference. And as we start to take over again, now that the pandemic is, we're pretending the pandemic's over. Beautiful observation, though. Thank you, Valerie.
And a lovely reflection to end on. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our event tonight. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. And thank you especially to Vivian, Neil, and Victoria, who all volunteered their time to make this event possible. Tomorrow, we'll be sending you a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about this event. The costs to produce Broadview's online reading club are minimal, but not non-existent. So if you enjoyed this event or past ones, please consider making a small donation. Even $5 or $10 would help. Please go to broadview.org/donate. Broadview reading clubs exist across Canada. If you're interested in joining a local club or starting one of your own, please check out our information pages at broadview.org/reading clubs. If your club isn't already listed here, please let us know so we can spread the word. Maybe Sharon, you can put your email in the chat there. So if someone has started up a reading club and it's not included there, they can share it with you. And if you don't already, please also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. After the event ends, please stay if you'd like for an informal discussion time. Our speakers may or may not join us, or we can chat among ourselves as well. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Be well, and hope to see you back here for our next online reading club on December 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern, where we'll discuss the December issue. Good night, everyone. Vivian, are you offering to read another poem? Because that would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Neil.
More?
Yes, that would be lovely.
Okay. Well, this poem I wrote after September 30th, Healing and Reconciliation Day. So I'll just read it here. I wept. I didn't cry when the house mother hit me on my hand with my shoe. I didn't cry when I was taken to the foster home in that car. I didn't cry when I took that first sip of that bottle. Then the walls crumbled. I wept when my baby boy was put in my arms, motherhood. I wept when I walked through those rehab doors. I wept when I shared my residential school story years ago. I wept when I walked with other survivors alone and together. Then the path grew wider. I wept as I stood with settlers and survivors. I wept as we walked that road, we filled it with that color of orange. I wept with those little ones that wanted to be heard and found. I wept healing tears today, for the past and the future. October 1st, 2021, a day after the event of the reconciliation. And I'll close that off with that one.
Thank you so much. I think Alan, you had a question for Vivian. Alan, do you want to ask Vivian if you're still here?
Sure, Vivian. There's a reference in the article to your journey, grandmother's journey as a pilgrimage, and I just wondered if it felt like a pilgrimage in that metaphor that we think of over the centuries, in Christian faith. So I just wondered if pilgrimage was another way of looking at your wonderful journey.
Yeah, pilgrimage that is continuing, and I think it's going to get a lot easier when I get when we're letting others know what we're doing and why, and when more church people like you join us, it becomes a lot easier. I've always said that when I share my memories and people actually carry it or share it, it makes a lot lighter. So I'm glad to be walking this pilgrimage road with you guys. Yeah.
We are as well. Thank you. So I think we'll end on that unless anyone else has a question or something they want to chat about. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a good night.